So the first things I'm going to talk about is power and organising in place. And I always remember I left school at 16 and I was a gardener at first before I came and worked for the Electoral Reform Society. There's big things in between that. But I was a gardener and I joined the trade union, and I was in the trade union because I'd grown up during the miners' strike. My dad was a miner, and I kind of got politicised during the miners' strike. So the unions was the place to go for me. And then somebody persuaded me to join the local Labour Party. And I always remember this local councillor gave me, I don't know if this would still happen in the Labour Party, but anyway, this local councillor gave me this book called Stephen Luke's 3 Dimensions of Power. Have you ever heard of it? But it's a very, very complicated book about power. And I can't remember anything in it. And there's all these kind of deep, complex philosophical theories about power. But we had this American trade union organiser visit us in Scotland called Jane McAlevey. She was a trade union organiser and became a theorist and academic. And she said, power is the ability for your community to stop bad things happening to you and to make good things happen to you. And that was the best definition of power I've ever heard. And the interesting thing about McAlevey talking about that is she came from an organising background, right? And I think if you think of the organising that went on in places like Chicago in the 1970s, or the whole trade union movement when it was more powerful, that kind of organising is a real source of power. And anybody that's ever kind of organised anything knows it kind of takes up a lot of time and resource. I think that and that's kind of why. So setting up all these structures, systems, processes of power take up a lot of effort. And I think
that's a lot of evenings, doesn't it?
Takes up a lot of evenings.
That's what Oscar Wilde said.
Yeah. And I think that's why on the left, right, we always think about, well, what we want to do is want to get control of those processes and systems and power. And that has kind of been a kind of strategy at the left. But for me, that is much more about taking power than making power. And I wonder if there's a different way to do that. And also the left we've always had this kind of centralised agenda of like, we'll use the institutions of the state to create equality and justice and redistribution. But also, I mean, there's different ways to think about that. You can think about it as reverse state capture. You can think about it as co-option of the institutions of power, or you can think about it the proper use of the institutions of the state. But it is largely about taking power. Coming back to place now, I think it's organisation is vital to create a place, right? To build the buildings, the streets, to deal with the litter. This all requires a great deal of organisation. And this is at least partly the role of local government, I think we would agree. And I think we can also think of that power of organisation in those institutions of sunk costs of organisation. They're already there, they've already been built. That's why we're quite interested in taking control of them, right? Going back a bit in history, cities, towns, villages were, for the most part, created by their inhabitants. Later supported by a central state, but in the beginning, most parts. There's an academic activist in Scotland who died a short while ago, but David Donaldson, one of his last posts was noting that the most important policies and innovations of the past, like general hospitals, subsidised housing, creation of comprehensive schools, invention of foster care, these were all created locally, usually in the teeth of opposition from central authorities. So it's clear that living as a community in a place, it's a very natural thing for human beings to do, is to bind together as communities. But it feels often, right, and I'm going to finish here and get your thoughts on this, it feels often like the governance of those places, like the institutions that govern them, are very separate from the community. It's like the community's on the outside trying to do stuff, and then you've got these institutions trying to do often good things, but why are they antagonistic and separate to each other? So I'll just leave it there for some thoughts on those ideas of local things and power. I guess framing the question would be, is the way that we run our local places separate from the community? or is there interaction, or does it feel like that? And I think that's partly true and partly not. So interesting to know what people think.
I think they're very separate. It's a simple answer. And I was in a meeting once about an issue that I won't go off into, but we were talking about Kent County Council. I'm not from Kent, I didn't know, but the way that people spoke about Kent County Council, these Kentish people, it was described by someone else at the meeting who I chatted with afterwards. It's like they are an occupying power of a foreign army.
Right.
And it really stuck with me because that was what it was like. Everyone just hated these people. I mean, really hated them. It wasn't just like, oh, we don't feel connected or involved. So, yeah, I think there's a big gap.
I think that's true. And I also think that it creates an adversarial blaming kind of culture. So in Bristol, we've had a big thing about the allotments. They were going to put the price up, make us cut down our trees. And it was done through a consultancy, which is money spent, basically wasting money, basically. And so now the allotments are now against the council, and the council's against the allotments, and this is not as it should be. I think it creates this blaming adversarial system, and it's just an accident of history. We've inherited hierarchical systems, and they're out of date.
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of working with local councils, thankfully not in them. And we just had huge problems. We had a participatory group of people wanting to do some really beautiful stuff. And because of the hierarchical system, you had one person that just blocked it. And everybody was saying, we'll get her out, there was a Labour council moving in, we'll get rid of this person. But I was like, you could just get somebody equally as bad and put them in that position. And I think it's the structure that they've got that just makes it terrible. Like, they can't interact in a community way because it's not how it's built on the inside.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to say, actually. I worked in a local authority for a short period of time, and I suggested to the team that I was working with that we might go out and talk to people. It was when universal credit was coming in, and I was really worried about that. And I said, should we just go out and actually do some... And the terror on people's faces was fascinating. Well, we did do it, and they really enjoyed it, and it was really, really valuable. But, their sense of embattlement on the other side of the wall was really interesting. So, you're reflecting a kind of picture that's sort of operating on both sides, I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go on.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to say, where I am, I'm in East Central Manchester, not massively far from where Manktopia was kind of filmed. And the reality for us on the ground, people living in flats, is that we are kind of I feel very disempowered by the management company who manage our flats. I think that's true for whether people are renting or own their flats, because the management company just make decisions and we are just completely and utterly handcuffed to them. The people who own the leasehold, it's the same thing. And then I think how we see the city council locally is that Manchester has been quite punished by the Tories for years and years and years for being left wing. So don't give them enough money. The way that the city council gets the money is by selling off every single piece of green space that exists to developers. So we kind of all feel that we live on this massive building site because the developers are constantly building shit in every tiny bit of green space that exists, and the city council, just when the developers approach them, just say, what would you like, and give it to them. But also I can see that they are using that money for health and social care to pay the enormous bills. It's not like they're deliberately, they're not green enough where I am Labour at all, but an interesting lots of constituencies voted Green as it was the second in those constituencies in Manchester for the first time, which was great to see. But just where we are, I think we feel very, very disempowered. I'm really interested in this to know how we kind of overturn that, because it's a lot of very powerful players. The management company is very powerful. The leaseholders are in administration, they're very powerful. The developers are very, very powerful and they've got a lot of money. And I think even the city council feels like quite a small player in terms of these massive capitalist, sort of microeconomies.
Yeah, no, that was a really good
long.
example of how it can be, I think. Yeah.
I would argue that the councils are institutionalised, entrenched, and self-serving in terms of their interests, their economic interests, that the people are used to being fragmented and isolated and have forgotten how to contribute and work together. And the people who are the social activists are many of them burnt out. It's kind of, you're doing voluntary work on top of your life. So I'd be interested to hear about the
There's a lot of
solution to
stress in a lot of bits of the local democratic system.
Hi, I had an interesting experience in Lancashire running a small popular assembly, and it was very fragmented audience with really strong activists, quite right-wing people, and the local mayor. And as I sat down at a table with 5 of them, they all individually said to me, when I was facilitating, this is going to be awful by the people that are in this room. And I held it quite tightly in order to make sure that we all listened rather than responded. And at the end of it, it was like an hour and a half, 2 hours. I was so moved by the actions of the really strong ones who were in tears, just saying, I've not felt in my role that connection before. And there was something about having to take off the role in order to properly work together that was a real eye-opener to me. Yeah.
Great. Maybe now then I'll talk a little bit about some of the problems and threats, because we think about local organisation and local democracy sometimes, and I just want to suggest that it's really vital for everything that we're facing, not just about their local issues and national government will sort everything else. And a guy that pointed this out to me, a guy called Stephen Noon, that made me kind of have this understanding of things that were kind of perhaps happening to us. And he was the strategist for the SNP all the way up to the referendum in 2014. So he at the time when SNP were really, really successful. But then he left and went to study to be a Jesuit priest. It's quite an interesting life. And he said to me once Jesuit priests have a very good education, actually, a bit one-sided on some things, but he said to me when he was studying psychology and philosophy, he realised that it's actually an evolutionary trait for human beings to see things as one thing or another, to have that binary thinking. It's quite interesting for Scottish independence, but anyway, to decide some good and bad, safe or risky, black or white. And it's really helpful, and why we're like that is because in very dangerous, life-threatening situations, it's pretty useful to be able to make a quick decision about something is life-threatening or not. It's also good to have discernment. I'm not saying like making good choices is a good thing, but that kind of that instinctive reaction to threat is quite interesting, because in the modern world, I don't think there's very much that's black and white. There's a lot of nuance and grey. And if you want to turn that kind of sense of hypervigilance up to number 11, I think you just need to add in the way that technology goes at the moment, right? You can interact at any time with faceless strangers. You can have your so-called community endorse whatever opinions are out there. These are ideal conditions for high anxiety, and high anxiety means division, right? And we're trying to live through some very, very difficult problems and solve some very difficult problems in a state of very high anxiety. And you'd have to be either a baby or a crow not to know that this is a bad thing. And if you throw in the brutal reality of global inequality, shrinking the world by the same technology, mass immigration, migrations of people escape war, climate disaster, we have some very, very big problems. And the history of technologies impacting upon social society in negative ways has never been one of uninventing them. Once the genie is out of the bottle, we're not able to get them back in there. But the history is also one of adaptation and mitigation and evolution even. So if you take the city slums, we got social housing. If you take the factories and the satanic mills, we got trade unions. And if you look at the climate catastrophe, climate change, we are getting some really amazing technological reactions to that. But I think we also need really require big social and political adaptations, and that because of the impact of this technology, and then exploitation of that anxiety and that fear by the far right and populism. We need to be able to respond to that. And I think that needs to come locally, or it's necessary to come locally. It has to come other places as well. But the only way we're going to be able to deal with these shocks, environmental and political, is when local people can plan and organise to get them together. And this is not an argument for bad things, obviously, but it's acknowledging that they are happening and that we need to respond to them. As I said at the beginning, I grew up in a mining community. My dad was a miner, and I'm not nostalgic at all for that, because many things have changed for the better since then. Not least we don't dig coal out of the ground, and people don't have to go down and dig it out, and they were also pretty machismo and sometimes violent places. But there are elements of that kind of past that do really interest me, and I liked them, and I think they can show me stuff anyway. And the big one was that sense of community and pride in the community. The miners believed that they were fueling the nation. They believed that they were doing something really, really important. And the Miners' Club was a social point for the whole community. We had bands, we had the football teams all sponsored by the NUM and run by the NUM. And we did care for each other in highly practical ways. We shared stuff. And there was a palpable change in that after the strike. Some had been broken, something had been defeated and weakened. And, I remember the first heroin addict in our community was almost a celebrity. And then within a year, they were an also ran, right? Because there were so many people. And I don't know if anybody's heard Gabor Mate talk about this experiment with rats, where when they first were looking at heroin, and they put rats in a cage with a little button that they pressed to get the jag of heroin, they were going it's the substance, right? Because the rats kept taking heroin until they were dead, right? But then somebody did an experiment where they left the rats in the cage with their family in a community, and they weren't interested in the heroin. And so I think my experience of these things is that you can build communities or you can destroy them. The neoliberal system, the economic system, started that alienation and separation. Jimmy Reed's famous speech about alienation, it's the cry of men and women who have no power over the things that are happening to them. I paraphrase Jimmy's amazing speech. But also then that's so amplified by technology, that sense of anxiety and division and fear that has been amplified. So this is where we are. I'll just leave it there for some thoughts on those kind of problems that we face. And then hopefully next bit a bit more optimistic on some of the things we might be able to do to turn those into adaptations.
So thoughts and questions, folks?
Garen Osborne from Clacton Community Transition. Years ago I was at a meeting in Totnes. They had a guest speaker from the back rooms of the UN climate negotiations.
Right.
And he was talking about mitigation, and I went up and asked him the question at the end, what about adaptation? We're hearing a lot about reducing, and this is about maybe 10 years ago, right? So things have moved on. But at that time, being naive and at the beginnings of getting into green stuff myself, I assumed that adaptation would be a big thing, because a lot of the climate change issues and what we call a polycrisis or meta-crisis with technology and all the stuff already locked in. We're going to have to adapt whether we like it or not. There's no choice about adapting. It's how we adapt. Yeah. So, but he looked at me thinking, well, no, there's no UN thing at that time he was aware of about adaptation. And that really shocked me. And I think adaptation gets a lot less credit than it should, because we're going to have to do it. We're having to do it now.
Yeah, we're in it, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're facing into the climate impacts era. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, please?
I think this applies to all communities across the country, but I think certain areas, including Scotland and the north of England, are really, really suffering. Particularly the post-industrial areas. I think they really, really have, and the gap between rich and poor has never been this great. So that's a huge, huge, huge problem, I feel.
I was interested in the connection, really, between what this gentleman was saying and your reflections on growing up in a mining community and this singularity of purpose. That you've got a mining community, and everyone in the community is somehow connected to the pit. Yeah. And adaptation offers us that opportunity. Actually, there isn't a bit of the country that won't be affected in one way or the other. They might be affected in different ways, but we're in a lot of trouble. And so I think adaptation could be this unifying thing, but it also has this horrifying potential, which we're starting to see with what Farage is doing. Apparently, Farage is quite interested in adaptation, which, is giving me a bit of pause for thought. It has the possibility to be quite nativist, to activate people towards the right, especially if they feel alienated. So your point about the rats, if people feel alienated, high anxiety means division. I think that's a really, really extraordinary phrase, actually, because we're going into quite an anxious time, aren't we? Other thoughts, questions, deliberations on this?
Just following on from the mining conversation, really, I was up in Workington recently as an activist at a Speaker's Corner event, just ahead of obviously going to the High Court to try and overturn the permission to build the Workington, the Whitehaven, West Cumbria coal mine. And it was the whipping up of that cortisol that was preventing any sort of community engagement. And as activists, we had lots of trade unionists and local councillors who were also on board with the need to channel into Green New Deals and to get real jobs rather than the pretend 500 jobs that were out there. But it was this clash of strong activist held beliefs on the one hand and the local traditional mining heritage of keep out outsiders that was like the biggest stumbling block, and this trade union style trying to not know its place between the two was an interesting one.
Yes.
Yeah, I think those traditions and ways of doing politics have got a lot of problems, right? And we need to address them. That kind of labourist, conflict-driven, actually. Even divisions in council. I mean, the way that we make decisions in trade unions or in the local council by having divisions, and it's just not helpful, right? Anybody else want to talk about the problems?
Yeah, Felic's got a mic. Please.
Hi. Been very interesting listening to this session. I'm from the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group. Yeah. And just when you're talking about the trade unions, I think one of the problems is, very, very much agree with you talking about the community before and what was lost, and also the pride in the community and the socialism and the self-education that's just been bust through. And I think the problem was that was also grassroots, it was communities. And what we have now in slightly diminished trade unions, let's say, we've got fewer people, but it's not just that. The hierarchies of trade unions is that we are actually going backwards on an awful lot of stuff. Yeah. And we did have a campaign yesterday that's talking about the misogyny in trade unions, because that's just one thing, one example of unions are not really fit for purpose. They're not activists. And we know that it's not the workers who are resistant to change. And, those areas you're talking about, the former mining communities, and somebody mentioned, the places that have really been, they're the places where we should be really looking at the climate jobs and the change. But the narrative is, because some of the senior people in the trade unions are digging their heels into business as usual, and even licenses in the North Sea. So we have to kind of bring that back and bring the trade unions back to community too. So we're having those real conversations about jobs and the jobs we need for the future. And I'm afraid that's still getting squished, and it's getting squished in the Labour Party as well. So it's kind of got a weird workers thing that is playing into the far right as well. Really dangerous. So we've got to take all that back and think about how can we devise our own climate jobs, but really have the local unions on board and cut through those bureaucrats, really.
Yeah, I think trust is spoken about a lot, and I think it's if you argue for equality and you're a hierarchical organisation, how would you trust? Why would you trust organisation? The Labour Party is the same. It's deeply hierarchical. Trade unions deeply hierarchical. So if you're arguing from that and you're saying it and you're not like it, then I think there's a trust issue. Do you know? If nobody else wants to talk about that, I'll tell you a bit about what we're doing in Scotland in response to this. And funnily enough, a little spider just landed on here. And that's funny because I was going to use a metaphor of a spider's web, which is it's a marvel of design, right? The really, really strong, almost invisible structure, but it's due to the fact that one thread breaks and others take up the strain. It's made from an amazing material as well, but its design and structure is part of why it's the strongest structure in the living world. And a community is a web of human relationships, right? The more trust and interdependency, the stronger they are. And it's the opposite of polarisation and division. And if we're talking about the institution or the vehicle that is going to bring about the political change in the future, it might have been the trade unions in the past. It's not going to be now, I'm afraid, I don't think. Maybe it's something more local. Maybe it's these sites of organisation. We all know communities form naturally, and just like families, which also form naturally, they can be more or less healthy. As I found out in Fife, the relational dynamics are shaped by what happens to them and their culture. They can be built by people working hand in hand together to make good places, or they can be divided, resentful, untrusting through exploitation and abuse. People here have worked in local government. They said it's a large and complex organisation. Some bits of it do work very hard to support communities, but it's often working against itself. The structures and organisations are pretty complex. They end up serving the organisation more than the community. Just saw that vote in Frome where the council voted for a commercial development rather than a community development. Bizarre, right? Because you can think about what that would give to the community if they were working together to build something together, but it was based on financial decision. And we live in a country that's highly centralised, top down. The more centralised and hierarchical things are, the more disempowered people and communities are. And those who want that to remain, I think it's up to them to make an argument about why disempowerment is good. It might be a case for it. There might be there's a national argument about why you need to provide infrastructure or something. But I think they just need to be made that, because communities are about human connection, and they don't have to be about place. Sorry, I've got a cough. But I think if one thing the pandemic showed us about like Zoom calls and stuff, that proximity and sharing spaces together is very, very important to be truly connected. And we also know the connection is really good for our health. And not only those deep friendships and family connections, chats in the street, little chats that you have, moans about the council, all of these things are actually very good for your health. But one thing that really, really builds community is giving people and allowing people to run the places where they live. Because it becomes we were talking about that shared interest of being in the pit, but place could be a shared interest as well if it became important enough. Or we were able to stimulate that. I mean, people getting together, talking together, thinking together about what to do and then doing it together, mutually giving and receiving. It's the basis of trust, the basis for best lives, and possibly the basis for the best places. So a human connection kind of encouraged, and also local government being about that, is essential to giving these conditions where people can live happy and healthy. And why would we not want to learn how to do that, to build these places, not only better in terms of services, but better in terms of human connection? So Dunfermline, where the ERS are working on this project, is near where I grew up. I was a local councillor there years ago. I worked on the local council as a policy officer. And we started this project there because we'd already tried it in a mining community in East Ayrshire, and they didn't trust us. We were coming from the outside. The rumour got about that we wanted to, instead of do a democracy project, we wanted to steal the money that was coming from the wind farm. That doesn't surprise me, because that community has been shafted again and again and again. So it takes what we learned was it takes a long time to build up trust. And why we can do it is Dunfermline, because I know loads of people there, and people knew me and knew my family, and it gives us a kind of head start. And And our project there is to try and help local governance adapt and evolve its institutions so communities can plan and run their own place. And we've been working there for a year, and I expect to be working there in 3 years' time as well. And that's okay because it's difficult and important, and we're determined to get it right. And we are expecting the Scottish Government to fund this because there's a long-running puzzle in government about what they call the delivery gap, despite all the intentions and rhetoric and what they say they want to achieve. The levers are pulled in Edinburgh and nothing happens. So there's people that are interested in this. And it's built around a standing citizens' assembly. Those of you that know about citizens' assemblies, it's a much more constructive way to make decisions. We know how to do this stuff, as that lady there said. We know how we can get people into rooms, and if you give them time and learning, they can, despite disagreement and seeing things, they can hear each other, which is probably the most important thing, and understand each other, and they can seek solutions together, and this creates connections and trust. And it's not enough to have 100 people in these, right? We have to get as many as people as possible through them. That's why having them local, I think, is really important. Because people that do go through them change. I don't know if you saw the people that go through these processes change, because they're not just brief committee meetings. They're in-depth discussions based on weekends, block periods. They allow people to understand each other and disagree, etc., as I've said. But as I said, having the Citizens' Assembly is not enough. That can be the core of it, right? But representative democracy is legitimate because people understand it. You vote for people and you get them and they represent you. It's been about for quite a long time. Not that long, really, in some terms. Some women have only had the vote over 100 years. But it's been about for a long time, and it's seen as being democracy, right? But it's not. Sharing power is democracy, right? It's just one pretty flawed mechanism of sharing power, actually. And these ways are much better. And should we really run our communities just as a way of mitigating problems that come down from on high, or should they actually be the solution themselves? And I think this connection and building of... This is about... I spoke earlier about taking power. This is about making power, really. And we all know that, and I know I can be, human beings at times anyway, hopefully for not a long time I've been cruel, but we can be frightened and selfish and greedy and deceitful, but we can also be courageous and selfish and generous and honest and kind. And I think if we're interested in shaping society, it seems pretty obvious that we want to shape it in a way that allows that latter to be rather than the former. Of course, we'll never get rid of these dark behaviours, just as we don't get rid of them in ourselves, but I think to turn up love and turn down fear just seems something that we should all be trying to do. It seems weird, but I think it's a fundamental role of local government, because if that's how we organise our communities, then that's probably the best place to try and do that. So happy to hear any thoughts or reflections on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to give a round of applause for that. I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about the detail of the way that you're working in Dunfermline. Can you just tell us what that looks like from day to day, just so that folks understand?
Yeah, well, we've spent a lot of time connecting with community groups and organisations, and it's very, very iterative. So we went with the idea that we want to have a long-standing citizens' assembly which will plan and design the future of the town.
And local authority folks are involved in this also?
The council's involved in it. The council's keen to do it. Government's involved in it because they've got a local governance bill coming forward. It's been on plan for a long time, but it is coming forward, and they want to use this as a pilot to see, because anybody that knows about these things, you can explain them and you can write about them. Sorry, I'm just recovering from a cough. But to show people them and experience them is a different thing, and I think it's very important that we can get politicians and decision makers and funders into them. One of the key things that we community workshop all the time. We try and get people together. That's why it's going to take a long time. And we're doing massive, we've got an outreach program where we get as many people as possible to sign up to the concept of it, community organisations group, long before the assembly even happens, which might be the middle of next year sometime, so that everybody knows what's going on, what it is. It can get a degree of legitimacy, because if we looked at the one, Scottish Government spent a lot of money on the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland and the Climate Change Citizens' Assembly, but nobody knew it was happening. Difference to the one in Ireland on abortion, where everybody knew what was going on. So I think, and it's much easier. It's much easier to do that at a local level than it is at a national level. So I think that's a key objective of the project, is to get as many people to know and understand what's happening. The second objective, there's 3 objectives that came out of the community workshops, is to make sure that it's not extractive, that it's an investment, and that people can keep doing these things when ERS goes away. We're determined to be there as long as it takes, but if we can train council officials in how to do this, and community organisers and activists in how to do this. Sortition have said that they'll give the software and do the training in order to do the selections. That's the way they operate.
Can you just explain Sortition? What do you mean by that?
Sortition is the way, it's a global organisation now that does the selection for the assemblies. So the assemblies have got to be made up of people that look like that area. So they're selected on demographics, and you can balance them always also to make sure that more people from ethnic minorities are involved in the assembly. So there's a way of selecting them, and they're paid. This is why it's reasonably expensive, and we need to get them money from the government, because people are paid for their time. There should always be a rotation as well, because we don't want them to end up as politicians. We want them to come out this kind of process which they do, much more engaged, enlightened and activated citizens, actually. I've seen it so many times. It's the thing I love most about the process when we've done it in other places, is they become activated. So, yeah, it's a long-term... I mean, probably if you were setting up a local council with a representative system out of nowhere, you would have to take this time to explain it and engage people in it. So we're having to do that. But it's, so it's not to be extractive, it's to be sustainable and to be done as cheaply as possible in a way. But also it has to fit into the decision-making processes of the council at the moment. They have to buy into it so that it actually has some impact. So those are the 3 things that we need to make happen. Because again, we've seen Citizens' Assembly of Climate, Citizens' Assembly of Scotland, democratically legitimate as the Parliament, right, as a political theorist that is, but banged up against that, the Parliament and I met with the Minister and with the Minister's civil servants. They knew it was democratically legitimate, but didn't know what to do with it. So we have to work out how these things can be institutionalised into the current structures.
Thoughts, questions? Yeah, lady at the back.
I'm Jane. So has your council got as far as actually committing to actually a process whereby they will take on board what comes out of your citizens' assemblies?
I'd say they're in a process of doing that. I mean, we've got support from... the good thing about Fife Council, it's still got a very big community development, community education section and ethos, and they're fully bought in, and we've got a senior director who's working with us on this, who's getting it through the committee system. So he's looking at how that would fit into the committee system and the budget system, and he's pretty convinced by it, I think. So, but it takes time to work all this stuff out, I think, and to get it right, and to try stuff out and it might not work, and then try something different.
Well, 2 questions. One of them is, how do you ensure that the citizens in the Assembly are engaged with the issue? One. And the other question is, you talk about love, which is a word that kind of isn't comfortable. How do you help shift people from cortisol into serotonin?
Yeah,
That's a great way of putting it. Okay.
I think that's a great question. Do you know what? We really do know how to do this well around the world, because these things are happening all over the world, and it's been happening for decades now. And we know, the processes and techniques to do it. And there's a big education section in it, and the facilitators are kind of really trained, and it's actually amazing. I mean, people don't have to come if they don't want to. So a lot of people will come for the money. Some people will come for the money. But it's actually amazing you see the transformation of people that go through these processes and these techniques. We're pretty good at it now. I'm talking about the democracy sector across the world. People do feel really uncomfortable talking about love, I think. But I think that, talking about it in those physiological terms is probably a useful way to think about it. And I think that human connection is what does overcome the cortisol. Stephen Noon, the priest, the strategist turned priest, he's an academic now actually, but he said to me that, because I kind of did understand a little bit about that, anxiety, division, fear thing, right? But I didn't understand what the response to what it was. And he said it's relational, right? The response to that is about human connection. So if you want to deal with anxiety and fear, you get people to feel comfortable and engage with others. And these we design these forums in order to do that. So I think that's the answer is human connection, really. And not council chambers or, trade union debates where the cortisol's turned up and the serotonin's turned down. That is part of our problem, right?
Yeah, I'm Steph, and I've got a question. I think I might have missed something, or I'm a bit confused. But you use we and us an awful lot, and I don't know whether that's just because of where you come from, that's the way you speak, or whether you are actually a group of people, or are you on your own? And if you are a group, how did you come together, and what are you as a group?
Okay, good question. I work for the Electoral Reform Society, which is in England, and I'm based in London at the time, is the big, over 100 years campaign to get proportional representation in the Parliament and to reform the House of Lords and to do devolution in England. But in Scotland, luckily enough, we have electoral reform, we have a PR at the Parliament, and we have PR in local councils. So we can focus a bit more on how democracy might evolve. Because I think most of us will agree that representative system is pretty flawed, right? If democracy, and that confusion about democracy being about voting instead of about being sharing out power is, it's quite important. But I think we have to we have to develop processes that are much more about sharing out power if we're really going to protect democracy and solve all these problems and turn cortisol down.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for breakfast this morning as well.
So we've got about 5 minutes to go. I wonder if there are any other thoughts or questions. I think it's been really interesting. I'm wondering about deliberative democracy stuff that's going on in your area and good things that you might want to tell us about. Any other thoughts?
Glastonbury Town Council. We have a Green majority in Glastonbury Town Council and have had since 2017, I believe. We've been holding People's Assemblies for at least the last 2 years, possibly 3, can't recall. As a council, we're implementing a lot of the thoughts and policies and aspirations that come through the People's Assembly. I'm very much aware that throughout the country there are many vacancies, casual vacancies at parish and town level, and some of them don't even need to have an election. You can be co-opted onto your local parish and change things from a grassroots level from within just by getting into that place, building a bridge rather. The democratic process is already there, and we as a town council are implementing, if not citizens' assemblies where you pay people, people's assemblies where we get the people to come forward and feel part of the democratic process. So I'm just like appealing to everybody out there that there are places on your parish council where you can step up to the mark and have a voice and change.
And can you give people a flavour of the kind of things that parish councils end up overseeing, just so they get a sense of what they might be involved in?
For example, parish councils, they don't have a ceiling on the precept. You can raise your precept by 1,000%. If you have public backing and for a community project, you can raise your precept accordingly in order to pay for it. It's a no-brainer. County councils have a 5% ceiling on the raising of the precept. We in Glastonbury raised it by 50% last year and 50% again this year, partly to fill the gap where the county council are practically bankrupt, and they're kind of redirecting a lot of their services towards us, or we anticipate that, but also partly to pursue local projects. Like there's a big will for us to become a World Heritage Site status, and we're going through that early process. For example,
thank you.
We've been able to employ a climate emergency officer, climate and ecological emergency officer, for the last 4 or 5 years out of the People's Assembly.
So that's a structure that is already there, people can get involved in, and they would just approach the parish council in their area.
Exactly. We'll advertise it, and we hold assemblies at least twice a year.
Great. Okay.
But that can happen throughout the country, given the political will.
Thank you. That's
without
great.
any cost at all.
Okay, please.
So I live in Bristol. We now have Central Bristol now has a Green MP. And a few years ago, when Labour had the dominance in the City Council, a fellow XR member who was a Green councillor organised a Citizens' Assembly, which was through sortition and people were paid.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
it was very successful, and there were 4 times they met, and there were 80 people, and every single person turned up every single time.
Yeah.
However, then it fizzled out because there is this gap, as you've been describing. I'm hopeful that now we have a Green MP and we have finally Labour has been ousted in the council. That this will happen again, but again, there's a question of money. We'll see if they do. So it's a sort of good, but not so good in that they came up with some great suggestions, but nothing ever happened.
Yeah.
So it's making those
So
connections.
the
like you
suggestions
described.
weren't taken forward.
Nothing really happened, you know.
Right,
So
wow.
they're great suggestions, but because, as you've described, there wasn't this connection and integration, it kind of fizzled out. So.
This is a real challenge because people lose confidence in it, right? But I think what will happen is, things will bubble up and fail, and things will bubble up and get a bit further, and it'll just be really gradual that we can start to make this evolution into the next phase of democracy. But yeah, I think that is disheartening when things don't. That's why it's really, really important for us to kind of try and make sure that it does go somewhere and has got, the community behind it as well gives it power. If it's kind of standing alone and nobody knows what's happening, then it's not as powerful as if people have watched it. So in Germany, for example, they actually did when they did the selection, the sortition, they did a TV kind of program on who was getting selected, so it kind of made people more aware of it.
Sadly, we're kind of up at time because we need to prepare for the next session. But I really wanted to thank all of you for participating and perhaps give a round of applause to yourself and to Willie for the session. Thank you.
Thanks.